All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast. We're going to get into a great episode here in just a second. Flying solo on a Friday night, bonus kind of content coming off a fantastic late rally victory for the Brooklyn Nets over the Philadelphia 76ers down in Philadelphia. Going to let you know, of course, that we appreciate you making us your first listen of the day. You can, of course, get us on all those great platforms. It's entirely free. And that this episode is brought to you by McDonald's. Proudly serving communities since 1965, McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get great, tasty, affordable food. It's an unofficial community center. A big thanks to you, our friends at McDonald's, for always being there. As some people would say, like Koo over on the Locked On Pistons podcast, ba-da-ba-ba-ba. I am loving it. Let's get into this game, of course, right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. And no more important day than a Friday night when the Nets, listen, seemingly we're going to continue to have that struggle of finding their rhythm, figuring some things out early in this season. And yet they figured out on the fly a little bit and give us a really exciting victory there, 114-109 over the Philadelphia 76ers, a late rally in this one. We're going to get into all the details of some of the late sequences, obviously cover the Kevin Durant, the James Harden storylines in this game, and then get into some of the details around other players like one LaMarcus Aldridge and, of course, Patty Mills, and then even the not so favorable performances like a Joe Harris, like a Nicholas Claxton. We're going to cover every single piece of that here along the way. But the big thing right off the top, obviously, this is a game that over the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter, the Brooklyn Nets went on a 16-1 run. The key sequences here are with a 104-108 line. Kevin Durant with a three-quarters court outlet pass to a very heady, smart, leaking out Patty Mills. He lays one up and in. You then get LMA under the basket off the James Harden feed. That goes ahead and ties it up, and one puts them ahead. LaMarcus gets back in there on a sequence following a handful of Danny Green just airball triples. Then you also had Embiid dealing with his knee issue. He gets in under the basket. Aldridge is there once again, disrupts that rhythm down the other way. A couple of sequences at the free throw line, obviously, as is the nature of the NBA. And ultimately, the win. But we start at the top of it because the way this game started out, specifically around Kevin Durant and James Harden, is listen, I said this over on Twitter. This is the narrative that I think we're going to come into the season, given the way Kevin Durant performed in the playoffs last year, given the way that he performed for Team USA in the Olympics as well. Kevin Durant is right there in form, man. He can get it whenever he wants. He was attacking from the start of this one as well, really finding his spots. We know that when he gets inside the arc, gets off those elbow looks, the mid-range jumpers, it's almost close your eyes and assume that they're going in. And he really looked good. By the end of the day, now, as you go back and think about the first game of the season against the Bucks, sometimes, as we've said, Kevin Durant can be a little ho-hum in terms of you're watching the game, you see how that he's having his shots, he's making some of his buckets, finding his rhythm. And then ultimately, you turn around and you go, good Lord, look at this stat line. And for example, off a 37-minute performance, 9 of 20, only 1 of 6 from beyond the arc, but obviously hit every single one of his 10 trips to the free throw line, gave you 15 rebounds, gave you 12 assists. They call that a triple-double in the NBA. And he was the catalyst. He was the motivator in this game. He was the one that was keeping things going here early on. And by the way, again, while the Nets were trailing early in this game and through much of this game, it didn't feel quite the same way that it did against the Bucks. It seemed like the Nets were figuring some things out, but obviously it was still very much a work in progress. They ran back out with the exact same starting five that they had out there for the Bucks game. And then you saw a little bit different look there. Carter's the first guy that comes in to start creating the second wave of this offense. But before we get to that, the other key player, the other superstar here is one James Harden. And the reason why we come to him is because some people, listen, fans, one game, two games, right? Go back if you listen to the last episode solo from Doug Norrie talking about the preview for this matchup. And it was, you know, don't get too low off the first game. We're not going to get too high off of this performance per se, but there's a lot of things inside of this that are really good samples for the Brooklyn Nets going forward and explains or gives us the kind of performance that we wanted to see with the additions of LMA and of Patty Mills to say, okay, we get it, right? We all thought we knew what it was on paper in the offseason. Now we start to get a little bit more of a taste of that. Patty Mills, by the way, still not missing a three-pointer to this point of his very young Brooklyn Nets career. But James Harden in this one, getting there. He's getting there, right? Doug had mentioned it going back prior to the Bucks game. We talked about it afterwards. Only got to the line 4 times in that game. That's not going to be good enough. In this one here, when you talk about Harden, he got to the line only 4 times again, 3 out of 4 there. Still not quite getting all the way back into his form, but I think it's the thing that we overlooked, and we've said this now for a couple of episodes here. Remember, coming off a hamstring injury, he didn't get to continue playing basketball throughout the offseason like Kevin Durant. So Kevin Durant very much looks like he's in midseason form. I'll go ahead and say it right now. The guy's going to be in MVP form all season long here. But for James Harden, you can see from game 1 to game 2, a little bit better. And really, even from first half to second half, I thought that Harden started to do a lot more downhill attacking, getting into the lane, right, and trying to really force the issue against the defense and then create some of those opportunities on the outside and these other looks. Now, we'll get into later the sequences when we talk about Nicholas Claxton, the bigs, and those rotation pieces of it. But I just think it's important to remember here that Harden he's still not 100%. And I think you saw it start to get up to speed there in the second half of this one, but it's still going to take him a little bit of time. I'm going to go off screen here just a little bit to make sure that I cover some of the things that I liked in the start of this game. Now, by the end of it, the 5 that you want to have on the floor and the way that these rotations fleshed out, it looks a little bit different. But when you go out there and you start to have Griffin taking on that challenge of Embiid, getting Nicholas Claxton, who was in the starting lineup for this one, off of that, makes all the sense in the world. Griffin continues to be the physical presence here when it comes to taking on some of those more difficult matchup that we said we were going to come into here. But again, I don't want to go too far afield here, but Nicholas Claxton, the sample size, a little bit shaky there. Once we get out of the 2 main superstars in Kevin Durant and James Harden, and by the way, here's the last footnote that I want to make sure we cover as still buzzing on it, by the way. I got the excitement inside my bones here off of this game. But the one thing that we know out of these 2 games here, I think, is that Kevin Durant, in the absence of Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant is the engine here. Kevin Durant is the one that is going to be driving this team in terms of right out of the gates to start games. He's got to get his looks. James Harden wants to facilitate first and then look for his shot second. Now, it doesn't mean that he's not going to get on ball, get some ISO dribble, and look to take those perimeter shots, but you have to understand that Kevin Durant is the alpha scorer. He's going to be the number 1 first point of attack, and then everything starts to build off of him. And I think the combination we're seeing here, again, without Kyrie Irving, is that James Harden needs to think about being attacking at the basket, getting into the lane early, allowing Kevin Durant to find his spots in and around the perimeter, just inside the arc, etc., and then build from there. Kind of work inside out if you're James Harden, because as you attack towards that defense, you see how it starts to open up some other opportunities. Some of the perimeter shooters get some easier looks. And then as we moved through this game, you started to see some of the interior work for the bigs really be able to take effect because you had to respect the different areas that the Brooklyn Nets were going to attack you from. We'll continue to get into that here in just a moment. But before we do, of course, we remind you again, thanks for making us your first listen of the day. We greatly appreciate it. We're available on all those fantastic platforms, wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. And of course, today's episode is brought to you by McDonald's, as we said at the top. McDonald's is a fantastic spot. You want to hop in there. You're coming on home from a long road trip, the last leg. You get in there, you get yourself a little McFlurry. I've always been a fan of the warm apple pies myself. And it just gives you that little extra boost, that warm, fuzzy feeling that you're home from the big trip. And that place, McDonald's, is that little stop off, part of the community where you get to feel like you're getting everything that you need, everything that you want. Everybody goes there, whether, and listen, it could be after a big game. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, if he was part of this team right now, maybe James Harden, maybe they tried to get together at their local McDonald's and hash some of this stuff out in the offseason. Now they get to go over there for a celebratory ice cream sundae, right? Maybe a Big Mac. I don't know. We've been hearing some guys on the network talk about those sausage McMuffins in the morning as well. The bottom line is you can head over to your local McDonald's and refuel and reconnect. Did somebody say Locked On Nets watch party? I don't know. We'll tease that out there for you. End of the day, it's McDonald's. You know that I'm loving it. You can go ahead and sing those words for yourself if you'd like. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. McDonald's. Now, back into this as we have this conversation here. The second piece of this is beyond the stars. We start to think about the starting rotation and where this got to. But here's the best part about it, and I'll try to get into here when we get a chance into some of the chat here because we're live over on YouTube for this one. Won't be going out as a podcast episode, basically exclusively there. So I just want to cover a couple more of the game notes, and then I'll dive back into some of these comments and respond back to you because that's something that we wanted to do on the podcast as we get live here on YouTube and head into this season is just allow you guys to have a voice and get to interact with you a little bit. The clear takeaway here is also LaMarcus Aldridge, right? So when you go back and you think that Nicholas Claxton starts this game, here's what that is. He is what they call a placeholder. And whether or not this game in and of itself and what we got from LMA in the second half of this one is, him being fully back out of retirement, ready to give you X amount of minutes per game and take over that starting role. I don't know when that's going to occur, right? We've talked a lot about that ceremonial starting lineup, Blake Griffin, even Nicholas Claxton, because he's been a part of this team for a few years now. But LMA is the difference maker when you talk about the bigs on this roster. And it's specific. I mean, you saw it in this game. It's specifically because he has the ability to knock down those mid-range jumpers with consistency. So when you go back to the start of this one, and everyone's been talking about it, the James Harden trying to get those lob passes to work with Nicholas Claxton, right? Yeah, you end up going, good Lord, at some point. And there's a combination here, right? At some point, James Harden, and he started to do it in this game, needs to start to drop those floaters in. Because as you do that, whether it's Embiid, whether it's going to be Drummond, whether it's going to be on a switch and it's Harris, whoever, you need to start to pull somebody out away from that basket so that, listen, has Claxton been impressive here early? No. But you can't have Embiid sagging back towards the basket. Nicholas Claxton's trying to set a mini screen, then roll back in and dump, grab that, put it through. It's a difficult sequence here. So that was again, giving you that mixed bag early in this one. But what Nicholas Claxton can't do, and what we'd say Blake Griffin can't do, certainly with consistency or the consistency you might want to see, and what LMA does do, he's silky smooth on the elbow jumpers. And once you start to do that, it forces, in this case, Embiid, in any case, the opposition's five to pull out away from the basket. It opens up the paint. Now, on those dribble penetrations from Harden, as that lane starts to collapse, it opens things up for the perimeter shooters. And one thing we really didn't get a lot of in this game, saw a couple of instances of it, we didn't see a lot of in the Bucks game either, was the second, the third, the fourth pass, right? The ball rotation out there on the perimeter, still not a part of this offensive game yet here as everyone, again, tries to figure out where they fit into this. But these little sequences are things that I think you're starting to see where Steve Nash wants to ultimately take this roster. It's just about how many minutes are you going to run LMA on a game-to-game basis? And then you get into matchup dependent as well. If you come up against smaller teams, well, then you can afford to roll out those smaller 5-ball lineups with a guy like Griffin. Millsap, still another guy that's trying to figure out his spot here and get himself into some early season rhythm. But then you can go a little bit smaller and you can save LMA. So again, this isn't going to be, we talked about it coming in the preseason. LMA is not going out there for 35 plus minutes with consistency on a night in, night out basis. But on a matchup to matchup basis, you can see how effective he can be. So he ultimately is the 5 for me, right? This is one of the missing pieces when we talk about this offense. And especially, again, go back to the top. Without Kyrie Irving on this team, you need a more effective shooting big at the 5 because you've lost, obviously, a massive part of your offense when you lose Kyrie Irving, and it completely changes that dynamic. Let's take a little look over here before we continue on into some of the comments that we're getting over on the old YouTube chat. Yeah, you got Crimson Striker there again. Yeah, still in the experimental phase, of course. You've got the Skyline talking about how many games last year did we lose when these situations came up. Right, and again, that's a big part of this. So we were talking about coming into the season. How are you going to account for not being that big? And really, when even LMA, even adding Millsap, we talked about them being bigger in the sense of maybe not taller, but they certainly, there's more length to this team defensively, and there's more muscle. There's a little bit more thickness to them. And you can see that even on these sequences. I mentioned it during the game here when I was texting with Doug. The sequence where you have Embiid coming down the court, and LMA ends up drawing the foul, taking the foul there late in this game. But you like that LMA gets a little bit physical with Embiid. And by the way, you can throw LMA at him for a few beats. You can throw a little bit of Millsap at him if you wanted to. You can throw a little bit of Blake Griffin at him, and you start to wear down the bigs of the opposition. And that's the difference, or that's at least what we think, right? Out of this sample size, we'd say Embiid obviously dealing with a knee issue coming into this one, but you see how the Nets have this theory in their mind. We weren't going to go out and get an elite big. There's no Embiids out on the market, but we can do it by committee, and we can end up wearing down a team through our effort, through our energy. Again, I've mentioned Blake Griffin a couple times here. He continues to do that dirty work, obviously. LaMarcus Aldridge is the man we're speaking about, just in case anyone in the chat was having a hard time picking up on that one. Now, the other side of this, though, is here before we get into it. Going to remind everybody about our friends over at Built Bar. You know who could use one of these as this game closes out? It's going to be LaMarcus Aldridge, because he has been out of the game going back to last year, enjoying retirement. That little boost of protein is something he's going to want to get in his system before they have multiple games coming up here in a few days. And they may need a lot more LMA out there on the court. And the great thing about Built Bar is that they're not just healthy and good for you, they're also delicious. You got flavors like cherry barcia, raspberry, mint brownie, double chocolate. Me this week, it was salted caramel last week. Going cookies and cream. I like that. I like that ice cream kind of flavor, but knowing that I'm not killing myself on any of what Doug would refer to as the stat lines. Because when you get inside these protein bars, it's 17 to 18 grams of protein, calories ranging from just 130 to 180, only 4 to 5 grams of sugar, only 4 to 5 grams of net carbs. Amazing flavors, all tasty and all healthy. You can order it today. Like I said, cookies and cream, that's my recommendation, but you take it wherever you want. They're all going to be fantastic. Built Bar, by the way, is also the official protein bar of U.S. track and field team. Come on. What else do you want? Players at the highest level of athleticism being sponsored by a delicious protein bar? Boom. You head over to built.com and use promo code locked on, and you will get 15% off your order. Use promo code locked on and get 15% off at built.com. And so, because as we came out of that Bucks game, Doug Norrie and myself said, we're not going to overreact to what we're seeing here. It's obviously early stages. It's going to be a work in progress. And guess what? There's still plenty of things to look at this game and say, some things we may want to work on. Talked about Nicholas Claxton getting the start. I think he has been just a placeholder. And while it pains me, maybe Doug and I, and certainly even more so Doug going back to last season, we're on a little bit more of the strong track in saying, hey, this kid is not going to be the answer for you. And again, it comes down to the limitations specifically on the offensive end. He's still trying to figure things out, still trying to find himself there. Now, I didn't mind, as I got to go to the notes here for 1 second. One of the things early in this that I thought was good is when you put Griffin onto Embiid. The nice thing there is you keep Nicholas Claxton out of that type of matchup. So now if Embiid's working down into the paint, you're keeping Claxton kind of out of that shuffle and risking getting, listen, anyone's going to get pummeled by Embiid, but you also put him in a better spot to work on some of those defensive switches where potentially you're talking about a Harris, right? If you want to move off from KD, depending on what that looks like, it actually makes a more favorable matchup for his versatility, given that he is undersized, especially against the center like Embiid. That being the case, the work around the rim on the offensive end still isn't there. He's just still looks like he's thinking, right? When you get out there, you want to be playing in rhythm. You saw LMA start to get to that place. You see that Patty Mills came in from second one on the Brooklyn Nets and is imperfectly in rhythm with a lot of his teammates there. Claxton still needs to get there. The question that I'll have is, will Steve Nash and this staff still continue to say, we need to continue to find minutes for Claxton throughout the games? Because remember, last year, when you had DeAndre Jordan, you looked at this and said, hey, we're going to run and run and run and run. We're going to go all the way down this road. But then what are you going to do when it comes to the playoffs? And even right now, the guy with the highest upside, right, with the most untapped potential, with the most unknown to his game is still Nicholas Claxton. Now, that doesn't mean that I think he's going to build up to be your starting five when it comes to the playoffs, but he might be as important a contributor as a Blake Griffin or as a Millsap behind LaMarcus Aldridge when you get to that point. So I think you still need to continue to develop him, but don't be shocked if we slowly see that transition from Claxton out of the starting unit and then really getting back to kind of where Doug and I had said leading into the season, end of the bench, looking for some minutes here and there, finding their spots, trying to get him some favorable matchups. Patty Mills has obviously been phenomenal, but the guy that people have kind of been looking over at is Joe Harris, right? He has another uneven performance in this one. Didn't shoot terribly well from beyond the arc, got down at the basket a little bit. He led the team, a double check here, behind Kevin Durant and behind James Harden. It's still going to be Joe Harris. He had 14 shot attempts from the field. Aldridge ended up finishing 10 to 12, obviously, but 12 attempts there, 23 points. His big performance that helped lift the Nets in this game. The only thing, and Doug and I said this, right? With another ugly sample size, okay, you start to get a little bit more concerned, or you at least start to say, maybe this role is not going to look the same as it was last year. It's not a like for like taking out Joe Harris and putting in Patty Mills. You certainly get a little bit smaller in that regard, but across this roster, Harris looks like he is the one that is the most limited defensively, right? He looks like he's the least athletic player. When you talk about where they're utilizing him, sometimes even in the backcourt. You saw it in this game. Javon Carter had a nice performance. So they worked a little bit of offensive, defensive switch there on possession to possession late in this game. The only caveat that I'll give here, if he's going to keep shooting like this and when 3 of 10 from beyond the arc, obviously not good enough, hasn't started well. The only caveat I give you, though, is again about the pass sequences. I know that he got a lot of looks. He had some open ones that he didn't knock down. But the offense still is not running the way I think the Nets ultimately want it to. So again, whether it's LMA in the paint, whether it's Harden on driving kicks, the second and third and fourth passes in these sequences, that's really where you get the best value out of Joe Harris. He's a pure spot up shooter. You want him to be weaving through traffic, running his butt off, then getting to the corner, getting to the top of the key, finding his spot, and get that quick catch and shoot. Some of the sequences that we saw in this one, where it's ISO ball from Harden, you've got either Embiid, you've got a big out there on the perimeter trying to disrupt that passing lane. You get late in the shot clock, little bounce pass over to Joe Harris. It is a rhythm three-pointer for him, but it's not the ideal version of it. So again, I don't think they're quite getting the full offensive sequences. Harris is going to be the guy, probably out of this entire roster, that suffers the most when you're not getting that full run of the offensive set. So it's something to keep an eye on. But this is not Joe Harris fan club. This is not Joe Harris defense. He has to shoot better. Even if these aren't the perfect versions of these looks, he still has to knock down a couple more of these, had some big sequences, and really late in this game, after knocking down a nice jumper, got into the lane, he had a missed triple off a nice feed, went down the other way, got bodied out underneath the basket on it might have been a Danny Green or a Thibault two-pointer, and then went back down the other end of the court and promptly turned it over. So he's had bad sequences. He hasn't looked good. We'll see if anything starts to adjust here. But I think Steve Nash, when you talk about guys you're going to ride with, for extended amount of times and let them work through some early season issues, Joe Harris is going to be that guy. So don't expect him to go anywhere anytime soon. Check back in over on the live chat here just to see what else we got going on, if anything. Oh, hey, it's all going off here. Skyline back in there. Teams are learning about Brooklyn, consistent pressure, and the Nets will make mistakes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Again, and you got Crimson talking about if Kyrie comes back, the offense will be humming. That's the biggest component of this is you've lost you want to say actually the second best scorer if you put Kyrie from pure, on ball, create his own shot in the vein of a KD. He's your second best scorer, right? Your facilitator, and your second, third best scorer in James Harden is right there. But all the practice in the world, which by the way, briefly out in California, Kyrie Irving was a part of, but all the practice in the world isn't going to let you find that rhythm of how you replace that type of production on the offensive end until you get 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 games, 20 games into the season. So I know that people don't want to hear this, but you're going to have a little bit of patience. And frankly, no Ben Simmons, obviously, for Philadelphia. You had Embiid exit the game for a while, came in nursing that knee. But there's a quality win. There's continuity over on that side of it. When you talk about Tobias Harris, you talk about Korkmaz, you talk about, Thibault had a nice game in this one. You have the other Curry brother in Seth, right? So, I mean, these guys know how to play together, and that's why you've seen here these first two games. These are not, as I think Doug mentioned in the last episode, this isn't the Magic and the Thunder, right? You had that type of game like you had against Milwaukee. You do that against the Thunder on opening night? Sure. That's a little bit different, but these are two teams that are going to be there at the end of the season. So there's really nothing else that you can do other than say, let's see what the third game looks like, the fourth game, the fifth game, and down the line. But we'll get back into it on Monday following another game here. Doug will be back in. We'll break down that one. But at the end of the day, this second game, it gave you a lot of small sample sizes about what the Nets want to do in the absence of Kyrie Irving. And a lot of it can look pretty good. It took them into the second half to figure it out, but I don't even know if it's so much figuring it out as, again, Steve Nash just being responsible to some of those returning players, although we know Bruce Brown hasn't seen the court at all. But I think he believes that he still needs to get certain players a certain number of reps early in the year. You're not going to overtax anybody like Aldridge, like Millsap, even Blake Griffin, right? You're going to try to work these guys through. 37 minutes for KD. This guy's ready to go full bore, but it's going to take time. That's the general takeaway. The other general takeaway is that the Brooklyn Nets won the game. So the sky is no longer falling if it was for you coming out of that first loss of the season. And we, of course, we remind you, thanks for making us the first listen. Keep following us on all those great platforms, live here on YouTube if you choose to do so. And then when we are doing those podcast episodes, you download, rate, review, subscribe, wherever you listen. We're seeing the YouTube numbers go up. Doug has a very, very proud goal of making it to 1,000 subscribers by the holiday season. Call that your Christmas present to us. So please spread the word if you so choose. We really appreciate it. We'll start doing more lives like this, especially in post-game opportunities, so that you guys can get in on the conversation a little bit. And as we do, I'll get a better rhythm so that I make sure that I'm seeing your comments and getting a little back and forth feedback between us. As Doug said on the last solo episode, he did not venture into the quote waters at the end of the episode because that's my territory. But I was too excited to get on here to talk about this game, so I'm not going to give you a quote either, short of quoting Doug that he did not choose to quote. There you go, my friends. We will be back in bright and early Monday morning talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.